Take your seats. All right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Our next speaker is here, and he's Patrick Deneen, professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. Prior to joining Notre Dame in 2012, he taught at Princeton University and Georgetown University. From 2005 to 7, he served as speechwriter to the director of the U.S. Information Agency. His teaching and writing focus on the history of political thought, American political thought, liberalism, conservatism, and constitutionalism. His most recent book is Regime Change Toward a Post-Liberal Future, and his previous monograph, Why Liberalism Failed, was praised by President Obama and translated into over 20 languages. Patrick's stalwart support of the Stockdale Center programs includes taking a 6 a.m. flight from South Carolina this morning. So Patrick, thank you for being here, and we look forward to the discussion of the American regime and its future. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Barrett. Thank you for inviting me, and just let me express how honored and delighted I am to be here. This is actually a bit of a makeup appearance. I was slated to appear with Dr. Berkowitz, who you just heard from, in a bit of a debate right before COVID happened. So we did it online, and I felt like, not being able to come to the Naval Academy was, an unfortunate, one of those unfortunate things that didn't happen during that time, but I feel just delighted now to be here with you. So as you notice, I've slightly changed the title. I think that my assigned title was Post-Liberalism. I've slightly changed the title to Post-Liberalisms because what I want to talk about is a set of, in some senses, kind of the alternatives that are today very much in our midst, in the midst of the kind of crisis of liberalism that's been discussed, I'm assuming, having seen the program and heard a little bit of the last panel, that in many ways, I'm just going to state it as a kind of stipulate a kind of claim, which is that we are in a post-liberal time. That liberalism, in a sense, in the way in which we heard in the last panel, it used to be, in some respects, much better. And there's a certain amount of nostalgia for whatever year it might be, whether it's in the 1950s or the 1900, turn of the century, whatever the time frame was. When we're looking back, people are looking back and saying liberalism used to be in much better shape. The political order that seems to be the American political order was once in better shape, and now it's not. And so there's a kind of yearning to bring something either back or to correct some aspects of the current moment. But in many ways, we're in a post-liberal moment because you could say the very things that the speaker who will be following me after lunch, Francis Fukuyama, was celebrating in 1989, in many ways, those have come to an end. The condition in 1989, there was a kind of confidence about the American project and the liberal project. It was an age not only of America's triumph, but the global triumph of liberalism, that there, as Francis Fukuyama famously argued in 1989, there was no other ideological competitor. There was no other nation, even though there still were other nations that weren't liberal, there was no nation that really seemed to have a viable alternative, and that could be expected to be long-term. This was the beginning of, whether you want to call it the age of globalization, the age of neoliberalism, the globalized economy, a globalized kind of culture of liberalism, a confidence about the American order that was to be, in a way, the universal order for the entire globe. That has come to an end. And in that sense, I think we're in a post-liberal age. We've seen the end of globalization as a kind of, it still exists in some respects, but as a kind of ism or an ideology that has come to an end. Thomas Friedman once had a theory, a famous theory that he propounded, which is that any country with a McDonald's will never go to war with another country with a McDonald's. This was the McDonald's peace theory. Well, it turns out there was a McDonald's in Moscow and a McDonald's in Kiev. So that thesis has been decidedly disproven. We've seen the passing of the neoliberal economic moment. Right? Both parties now are now kind of, in favor of, increasing domestic production, of going after global straddling monopolies, tech monopolies. I mean, Joe Biden's FEC appointee has been praised by J.D. Vance, among others, and Josh Hawley. So there's a kind of growing sense that there needs to be a kind of restraint of this globalized neoliberal moment. And of course, we've witnessed an uprising all around the world, the liberal societies, against the open society that was once praised, a borderless world, a world in which nations receded in their central importance and a kind of global identity. What Pico Iyer once called the global soul would take its place. And that there was a quote at an institution I used to teach at in my building at Georgetown University, which began by saying, "The age of nations is over." And that seems not to be the case. So in many ways, we are already in a post-liberal moment, and the question that I want to place before you and myself is, what kind of post-liberalism are we going to have? Are we going to endorse? Are we going to see? I think, in some ways, to begin this reflection, and when I want to prospectively debate a little bit with as I mentioned, the speaker who will be following me, Dr. Fukuyama, who I think in many ways, like a number of the speakers here over this last couple of days, yesterday and today, do pine for something of a lost golden age of liberalism, which for him was 1989, if that was the sort of peak year of the liberalism that marked the end of history. But notice that it didn't last very long. In 2001, Francis Fukuyama suggested that maybe history wasn't quite done yet. And in 2016, he said, well, and as many people said, it seems that the age of liberal hegemony is over. Brexit was passed. Donald Trump was elected president. And so, having gone from a kind of confidence about the end of history, now we see a kind of, in a certain way, a kind of nostalgia for history that has been passed, a kind of past that is now, history has gone on. Now, when Francis Fukuyama wrote that article and then the book, The End of History, he was in his high Hegelian stage, his high Hegelian moment, that history was a kind of unfolding, and that unfolding, as it took place in the modern world, was the unfolding of regimes until we finally reached the point that we discovered, not because it was a theoretical matter, but because it was a historical matter, we discovered that there was an answer to the question, which had riddled and puzzled political philosophers since Socrates was walking the streets of Athens, which is, what's the best regime for human beings? What's the best political order? And we had an answer in 1989. The best regime and the only regime in this Hegelian moment is liberal democracy. What I want to suggest today is that Dr. Fukuyama maybe wasn't Hegelian enough. And he wasn't Hegelian enough because to claim that history had ended was in many ways to ignore a kind of basic insight that it seems to me Hegel or a Hegelian would note, that the answer to the question of what is the best regime itself had a problem, as most, if not all, political answers tend to have. And the problem that it had, which was recognized for a very long time by, among others, Alexis de Tocqueville and many others, is that liberalism itself has a kind of internal instability. It's marred and marked by an instability that makes the claim that this is the end of history, this is the final answer to the question, that makes this answer improbable. And it makes this answer improbable because of this internal instability that pushes it to become something else. It pushes it to become something else that seems to be its opposite, but in fact arises from the very logic of liberalism itself. Notice I'm now a better Hegelian than Professor Fukuyama was. The internal contradictions of liberalism push it to become something that is, on the one hand, illiberal, but on the other hand, arises from the very heart of liberalism, arises from its core. It's not, in a sense, unrelated to it. It is its progeny, it is its fruits. And one way of exemplifying this claim is to remark on something I've just finished teaching in a class that I missed yesterday at Notre Dame. I've been teaching John Stuart Mill's on liberty. And there's a real paradox at the heart of John Mill's great work on liberty, in which, in many ways, he acknowledges that what we might think of, whether the year is 1989 or 1955, that in many ways, what we think of as the kind of high point of realized liberalism, a society of freedom, a society of free inquiry, something that many conservatives at universities today pine for, society devoted to free speech, free exchange of ideas, openness, tolerance. That in fact, in Mill's own telling, that represents a kind of tenuous middle position. It is, in some senses, Mill argues, a good and necessary end in itself, free inquiry and questioning. But it's also a means, and he's quite clear about this. Openness and questioning and liberty itself is a means to another end, not merely liberty. Mill begins that great work with the following claim, that even though there's been kind of a success in the liberal project of winning limits on government, restraining the arbitrary power of political rulers, nevertheless, there is still a kind of real absence of freedom in the society in which he's writing in 1859, sort of Victorian era. The lack of a genuine freedom, even if the government is limited, that people still feel oppressed by the power of public opinion, by the power of the majority. When Mill reads Tocqueville's Democracy in America, he loves it. He says this passage on tyranny of the majority is exactly what I've been thinking about. He writes in condemnation, then, of what he calls the despotism of custom, the despotism of tradition, which he says, even in a society that's formally free, this governs in a very deep and pervasive way. This governs how we think and how we act and how we can express ourselves. Even if we're formally free, even if we have a lot of rights, we tend to be conformists. And the more democratic the society becomes, which it was becoming at that time, the more that power of public opinion will act as a kind of powerful and oppressive force. And the entire book is then written as a defense of those who are free thinkers, those, as he puts it, who engage in experiments of living. And experiments of living, which he says, will allow for the realization and the furthering of human beings as creatures who can enjoy, as he puts it, utility in its fullest sense, which is utility of being as human beings as progressive beings. So notice the claim and the arguments he's making here, that liberty serves the end of progress. It serves the end of moving society out of its customary and traditional forms, challenging the despotism of custom, and ultimately, quite likely, overturning it. So when we just heard from Dr. Levin about the ways in which aspects of civil society and traditions of civil society have been eroded, well, this would be to Mill's delight. This would be proof positive that a liberal society will release us from the despotism of custom, and indeed make society ever more progressive. Indeed, much of the argument of On Liberty is a defense of those who are transgressive, those who confront and challenge and introduce a deep form of skepticism toward the customary and the traditional, in the name of progress. But here's the paradox. Mill recognizes that the society of open inquiry and skepticism will result in many of the questions that are being challenged, will result in those questions getting new answers, being resolved now on the side of the progressive and transgressive view of things. That this open society will increasingly answer more and more questions. And he even says at one point, such a society will start to look a lot like what was once a kind of orthodox, will have a kind of new orthodoxy. And he suggests in such a situation, as more and more questions get solved, we may need to have some people around who will ask kind of challenging questions, kind of a version of the Catholic idea of the devil's advocate. Right? Have someone around who just keeps things challenged. This is what Professor Robert George at Princeton proposes should be the case at Princeton, that you just need somebody like Robbie George at Princeton, or the now retired Harvey Mansfield at Harvard University, Robbie George at Princeton, to be around and be gadflies. We need viewpoint diversity so that we're not too comfortable in our orthodoxies. But notice what Mill is suggesting. You go from one kind of despotism of custom to a new orthodoxy, which will be a progressive orthodoxy, a transgressive orthodoxy, an orthodoxy in which the traditional forms have been overthrown, and a kind of celebration of transgressiveness takes its place. Now, if this starts to sound familiar to you, it starts to sound like the modern university, well, I think it's not without some reason. Right? Why is it that the universities have gone from being they went from being bastions of religious belief, the despotism of custom? My own university, University of Notre Dame, would have been one of those institutions that once was regarded as a backward institution. It had a theology. Students had to learn that theology and know that theology. And then, through the kind of free speech domain, all of those formerly religious institutions saw their old orthodoxies overturned, and now new orthodoxies govern in those institutions. And those orthodoxies now can't be questioned. And if you question them, you could be fired. Or at very least, you will be the subject of withering criticism by your classmates, by your faculty, and so forth. Notice what I'm pointing to here. What we think of today as illiberalism on our college campuses is not the opposite of liberalism. It is its fruits. It comes from within it. It arises from its very logic. It produces a post-liberalism. It produces the thing that it is in some ways, you could say, destined to become, if I'm being Hegelian about this, or has a difficult time not becoming that. Now, this instability within liberalism was recognized by none other than the great political philosopher who taught, or whose students taught, most of the speakers today. The panelists from, all three of the panelists from the previous panel, and Francis Fukuyama, the great German and German-American political philosopher Leo Strauss. And Strauss recognized this deep and profound instability within liberalism and articulated this in a really profound and masterful analysis of all of modernity, in which he recognized the way in which liberalism itself would generate, in some ways, its opposite, but also its fruits. This essay was called The Three Waves of Modernity, and was a speech that he gave in 1964 and was published posthumously in a collection of essays. In this essay, he argued that modernity has unfolded in a series of waves, and that image of the waves comes from Plato's Republic. Those of you who've had to read Plato's Republic, you'll recognize this, the three waves that have to be introduced to create the city in speech, right? The men and women being equal, raising children in common, and philosophers becoming kings, or vice versa. Those are the three waves of Plato. Well, in Strauss's telling, in a very Hegelian way, the three waves are, in a sense, the three ideologies of the 20th century, each one arising from the other. And the image of wave, while it's an appeal to Plato, is quite intentional, because if you've ever spent any time at the beach, which I hope you have because you live in Annapolis, at least for the moment, and you're in the Navy, when you look at waves, you notice something about waves, which when one wave comes crashing in, it goes out, and it sort of fills in the next wave. It makes up at least part of the next wave. And each successive wave is partly its own and partly what preceded it. And this is the appeal of the image of waves. It is very Hegelian in its understanding. Strauss argued that modernity, which he views as having been inaugurated by figures such as Machiavelli, gave rise to three waves, the three waves of modernity. And that these waves were, the first wave was modern natural right, the philosophy that was inaugurated by Thomas Hobbes, John Locke. He would even include Machiavelli in that number, Spinoza in that number. This is the philosophy of social contract theory. You could say this is the philosophy that inspired our founding fathers, the philosophy that we would recognize as sort of classical liberalism. The second wave was a response to the first wave. And in Strauss's telling, it arose as a challenge to the first wave, but also from the first wave. It was a modification on social contract theory, which Rousseau is, of course, the preeminent example. It's a way of retelling the story to achieve a certain different ends, and in particular, the idea of progress. And this is what makes Mill kind of interesting, because Mill sort of straddles these two waves. He kind of appeals to the idea of classical liberalism, but in the name and defense of progress. So he's someone who's a kind of transitional figure. And then the third wave of modernity. I heard the tail end of some Q&A, and I guess you're already talking about Nietzsche, so here he is again. All right. The third wave of modernity is a critique of the first two waves, but arises from the logic of those first two waves. That you have these three successive breaking waves of philosophy, which in Strauss's view ended up having corresponding regimes and nations. In the 20th century, or you could say the 20th century was the century of the working out of the logic of the three waves. And what you'll notice is that the three waves developed historically. Right? So you have the United States first, which also happens to be is the earliest of the philosophies of these three waves of modernity. And then you have the Russian Revolution and the rise of Marxism, which is headquartered in the Soviet Union. And then subsequent to that, the Nietzschean critique is especially manifest in the nation of Germany. So you have these three waves happening, maybe not coincidentally, in order, and they are defeated in order, backwards. Right? They're overcome in order. And so, in many ways, Francis Fukuyama was a kind of very good student of Strauss, or a student of Strauss, Alan Bloom, in seeing a kind of historical development that the answer to the question, what is the best regime, seemed to be once those waves recede, what's left is liberal democracy. And there was some confidence about that in 1989, but it seemed to me in many ways unjustified confidence. What this argument that Strauss made captures is that these three things seem to be sort of independent options, distinct from each other, at least at that moment, at that historical moment. But from where we are right now, it looks much more like an Hegelian phenomenon in which the three coexist precisely because they arise from liberalism. So once liberalism wins, it is going to continue to generate those successors, albeit now in a different form. And right now, I think we are living through the moment where we are in the midst of these three waves. They're like all around us. They're crashing in on us. It's not just one thing, and this is why we can talk about post-liberalism, not just as a theory. It is here, and it is here because of liberalism, because of the developments within liberalism itself. I've just mentioned one of those. Right? The first of, what we now call wokeness, woke progressivism, identity politics. It's often regarded as an aberration from liberalism, as a contradiction to liberalism. And indeed, one of the ways you'll hear it spoken about quite often by conservative critics of wokeism is that it's a form of cultural Marxism, that it represents cultural Marxism. It's a new form of Marxism, and it comes more out of the realm of culture as opposed to economics. And this is why it's not so focused on class warfare as much as it is on sort of cultural phenomena, capturing the institutions. Names like Marcuse and other more recent Marxists come to mind as sort of exemplifying this cultural Marxism. And it is not inaccurate to see a kind of level of Marxist response, because it is a response to liberalism. Like Marxism, you have a kind of victim class and an oppressor class. And if you can designate yourself or your group as a victim, you are going to make claims on the system as against the oppressors. It's a kind of core feature of Marxism. Right? But rather than the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, now it's whatever the victim groups are, and those expand every year. And there are subtractions, like the Jews used to be a victim group, but now they're not. Now they're the oppressors. So there can be shifts. But the main thing, in order to secure power under this cultural Marxist system, one has to establish oneself as a victim and replace then the oppressor, to have a revolution and replace the oppressor class being especially white people or white men or Christians and so forth. Now this is true, that this does have features of that second wave that seem to be opposite to liberalism. But as I've just been stating, it's inaccurate to see this solely as a departure from liberalism, what we today call sort of illiberalism on college campuses, as I've been suggesting with my brief summary of John Stuart Mill, arises from the heart of liberalism itself. In fact, the playbook for what we now see on college campuses by this second wave that's in our midst was written by a gentleman whose name I've already mentioned, Herbert Marcuse. In 1965, Herbert Marcuse published an essay, so the year after Leo Strauss. He published an essay called Repressive Tolerance. And if you read this, not a very long essay, if you read this essay, you will be stunned by how, not just prophetic it is, but how much it acted as a playbook for how, in particular, a progressive left will take over the institutions. And the argument is that progressives need to understand that they do not and cannot tolerate that which is not progressive. You need to tamp down and use the power of the state if you're not in a majority. You need to tamp down on any expression that doesn't conform to a kind of a progressive worldview. So here's one example of that from his essay, Repressive Tolerance. The active official tolerance granted to the right as well as to the left, to movements of aggression as well as movements of peace, to the party of hate. Does that sound familiar? To the party of hate, as well as movements of peace, as well as that of humanity. I call this tolerance abstract or pure. In other words, it's neutral, abstract, inasmuch as it refrains from taking sides. But in so doing, it actually protects already established machinery of discrimination. Now, again, does this sound familiar? Those of you who are tracking contemporary debates. If you even just paid attention to what happened over this past couple of days in Brussels, where they had the National Conservatism Conference, a bunch of reactionary right-wingers. The Brussels mayor said we have to close this thing down. Right? Police ringed the hotel where this was the third hotel where it was scheduled to be held because they canceled the first two. They got pressure on the first two venues. This was not, the idea was not to permit this event from happening. And this is in one of the most tolerant cities in the world, right? The heart of the EU, the governing center of the EU, was practicing repressive tolerance. Now, does anyone want to guess what thinker is most quoted by Herbert Marcuse in this essay? It's not Marx. It's John Stuart Mill. It's John Stuart Mill. And he quotes him not to say, I'm disagreeing with Mill. He quotes Mill to say, I'm agreeing with Mill. And he's agreeing with the Mill that I just presented to you, which is that Mill who argues that there will come a point where the conversation will move from one orthodoxy to another orthodoxy, and that we're now at that point. And therefore, we can no longer tolerate the conservatives in our midst, who are the party of hate. We just spell it now H8, right? That's hate. Here's one of the moments when he quotes Mill. I took a picture of this is from the postscript written in 1968. This piece got a lot of attention, and so he wrote a postscript. But what I really wanted to point out was that this is one of the instances, in addition to the several other instances in the essay where he quotes Mill favorably as giving him the kind of justification for why certain kinds of interlocutors need to be shut down, that here he appeals to the individual mental superiority of those in the Progressive Party, which justifies reckoning one person's opinion as equivalent to more than one. one person's opinion is equivalent to more than one. And this is where he famously, in his essay on representative government, proposed plural voting. That people who are more progressive, in his case more educated, who have more degrees, people like, the speakers up here, would get more votes than those of you fighting on the front lines until you get your doctorates or your postdoctorates. That you need to ensure that society doesn't become overwhelmed by those with backward opinion. Now, we have other ways of ensuring that today, bureaucracies and media and universities. It's not the equivalent of more votes, but it is a very powerful mechanism for ensuring that only certain views are aired. Marcuse then, in arguing as he does for a kind of a telos of progress, which is a phrase that he uses in his essay, appeals then to the kind of what he sees as the outworking of the logic of liberalism itself. So my first marker is that what we now today, or many regard as a betrayal of liberalism, actually is born right from the heart of it and its own internal logic. Let me offer you the way in which the third wave is present today, the wave of Nietzsche and Heidegger. And I think I've been told I got in a little bit late, but I was told you've already had a little bit of discussion about the thinker I'm about to mention. If we can call him a thinker, a kind of neo-Nietzschean, maybe it's a form of cultural Nietzscheanism. If there's cultural Marxism, there's cultural Nietzscheanism. It consists of lifting weights and slonking eggs and being manly. Yes, being manly. This is the Bronze Age pervert, the author of the Bronze Age Mindset, one of the most popular books written in the last 20 years that was published even without a publisher, entirely self-published book, published in 2015. Believed to be be written by Costin Alamariu, widely regarded as the mind behind the Bronze Age Mindset, who was a 2015 doctoral a PhD holder from Yale University, where he wrote his dissertation under 3 Straussians, interestingly, 3 Straussians, in which he argued that, in a sense, the Straussian tradition that he learned points to the fact that Nietzsche gets it right, that Nietzsche answers the question correctly, that Fukuyama was wrong and those who thought 1989 was the end of history. No, Nietzsche is the right answer to how one should arrange society. And I say this not just because, there's somebody who wrote this crazy stuff. This is immensely popular. Almost every elite college campus that I go to now, and I go to a fair number to give talks, the conservative students, at least some percentage of the very high, sort of ambitious, highly educated, especially young men, but not only young men on those campuses, are huge fans of the Bronze Age mindset. Pass it around as if in an underground. He has 150,000 followers on X. Costin Alamariu has his book, which is a published version and a sort of expanded version of his dissertation, was just published in 2023, the title of which, in distinction from the dissertation, which had kind of a respectable title, Nietzsche, Plato, Nietzsche, and Political Philosophy, the title of which is Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy. It's a book about recommending eugenics. And indeed, seeing the history of Western thought is essentially a project of eugenics, starting with Plato and the Republic. That book debuted at #1 on Amazon. Not #1 in political theory or eugenics studies, #1 of all books published. And it still ranks quite highly a year after its publication. This is especially attractive to talented, many of them young men, who are on campuses where they are experiencing the Marcusean form of tyranny. And they find in this author and in his writings a kind of a form of liberation, a commendation of their excellence, their distinctiveness, a call to be great, not to become part of the herd or the mass, not to embrace egalitarianism, not to be a victim. Notice the theme, right? Nietzsche is a critic of Christianity. Well, now the neo-Nietzscheans are critics of the progressive version of this in some ways, which is that one should seek to be equal in all things and seek to be a victim and victims are celebrated. Well, what is Costin or Bronze Age or whomever it might be recommending? Don't be a victim. Be great. Be a victor. Be someone who's distinctive and strong and powerful and doesn't conform, doesn't seek to be average. Now, in many of its most obvious respects, this philosophy, like Nietzsche himself, is deeply illiberal. There's just simply no question. It's not only is it anti-egalitarian, and I don't mean egalitarian in the sense of material forms. It's anti-egalitarian in terms of how we rank human beings. We can rank individuals against each other. We can also rank races against each other. We can rank genders against each other. And certain people are better and certain people are worse. So there is no idea, there's no theory of inherent dignity of human beings that you find in the Christian tradition. In fact, the Christian tradition comes under withering scorn and critique by the Bronze Age mindset. It's racist and misogynist and hierarchical. And yet, one key feature of liberalism is retained, which is celebration of liberation, of being free from the shackles of little people, of being great, of getting away from the mediocrity of the demos. Indeed, there are very Millian elements to Nietzsche that have been long recognized. A fairly recent, I think a forthcoming book notices this. Stephen Pitts, who teaches out of Colorado, has written a book called Nietzsche, Individuality and Spiritual Freedom that draws out the similarities between Mill and Nietzsche. And in particular, both of them use the phrase about their concern of the dwarfing of man, that the democratic age will lead to the dwarfing of man. Now, Mill states this concern in the voice of liberalism, that to be free means potentially to be great and even unequal, as we saw from the quote that I had up in Marcuse, to be more equal than the mass or the herd. And Nietzsche just simply says, well, this is, liberated from liberalism, from its Christian sort of remnants, and you get a kind of true form of liberty, the liberty from little people, to be great, to be the Übermensch, to be the oversoul. This strange but nevertheless striking way in which aspects of this Nietzschean, the neo-Nietzschean view and theory and philosophy, as a call for a kind of radical individualism, a kind of promotion of greatness, actually to some extent, maybe a considerable extent, and massaged to a considerable extent, can be overlaid onto aspects of classical liberalism. Capitalism, meritocracy. Right? What are these theories about? I mean, this institution is certainly one. It still practices meritocracy, I think. Right? Which is that you want the best. You don't want to have a lottery to pick the midshipmen, or Harvard tried that for about 2 years and decided to go back to the SAT. Right? You want the best. That our society, as a liberal democracy, as a classical liberal society, emphasizes that the best should, in some ways, attain and seek to attain distinctive and often unequal positions. And part of classical liberalism is to endorse the inequality that emerges, that greatness will emerge. And this is just simply an endorsement that greatness will emerge, now torn free of these sort of somewhat sentimental remnants of Christianity. This view is actually being promoted, among others, they told me I have to go with this, by this guy, who is the oversoul. He's the Übermensch. I don't know how many of you have seen him on X. He has about 100,000 followers. Richard Deneen, very popular among the same group of people. And he recently wrote a post on, I didn't put the full link in there, I don't necessarily want to corrupt the youth, but in which he made the case that there was a kind of Nietzschean liberalism. And he says, these are its basic features. This is from the Substack. There you have the website. Reconciling Nietzsche and Liberalism, my philosophy of Nietzschean liberalism. Right? And you can read the 5 of these. I'm not going to read them out loud. But this is his effort to, in response in particular to wokeness, to what Hanania and one of his interlocutors, Bronze Age pervert, regard as kind of leveling and demeaning and victim, the praise of the victim of the second wave. Well, this new, renewed third wave in our midst is being promoted as a kind of a way of resuscitating a certain kind of liberalism, understanding anew a new kind of liberalism. And here again, I want to claim that rather than just seeing this as the opposite of liberalism, as its contradiction, that it too arises from within the heart of liberalism. It takes one of its aspects, one of its key aspects, the liberation of the individual and greatness that can arise, and amplifies that to the nth degree. So these are, in many ways, the two post-liberalisms. And these aren't just theories. It seems to me that what's happened today is you have in America a kind of large number of people like some of the previous speakers on the right, and a large number of maybe some of the earlier speakers from yesterday who are on the left who want to revive and restore. Well, maybe Professor Galston represents something of a defender of left liberalism, and they want left liberalism to be renewed. But politically, notice, each of these sort of older classical or progressive liberals have aligned themselves with the post-liberals, either entirely in the case of the left, or increasingly in the case of the right, in which sort of some of the more popular figures, Hanania actually is pretty popular in certain circles, but people like Chris Rufo, whose name might be, Chris Rufo is often retweeted. He was retweeted yesterday by Bronze Age Pervert for his work done exposing the wokeness of NPR. Right, so there's a kind of growing alliance on the right with the sort of neo-Nietzschean post-liberalism, and on the left with the very prominent sort of woke post-liberalism. And rather than seeing these as, again, betrayals of liberalism, I think it's important to see these as developments out of and from liberalism. Now, I'm speaking here today because I represent an alternative that I'm trying to sell you today. What will it take to put you in my post-liberalism today? And I'm not going to do that at length. I've written a book. You can read the book. Buy the book? No. Steal the book. Steal this book. It's called Steal This Book. But my basic assumption begins from the fact that I think it's not just theoretically the case that liberalism, as we regard it in its ideal form, is unstable, but that it will lead to a post-liberalism in one way or another. And so my commendation is a post-liberalism that draws on the pre-liberal tradition. The pre-liberal tradition being broadly the classical tradition and the Christian tradition. I'm a Roman Catholic. I think the classical tradition, particularly from Aristotle, tracks through the Catholic tradition, particularly through Thomas Aquinas, and is here and present in the world through that tradition, which is available to anyone who simply can think through these through reason and understanding. In other words, what I want to suggest today is we don't have a real choice about whether we are going to be post-liberal. The choice we may have is what kind of post-liberalism will we have. And my commendation is I guess I would want to call it a kind of post-liberalism, which appeals to a pre-liberalism. It's starting to sound like, a postmodernist, post-liberalism. But it is a post-liberalism that draws on the tradition, the long tradition of the West, that in many ways is betrayed by all of the various waves. All of the various waves pick one aspect of the classical tradition, whether it's commendation of the dignity of the individual, it's commendation of the fact that we are creatures that are social and political animals, in the telling of Aristotle and Aquinas. That the first wave and the second wave both articulate something true about our humanity, and even Nietzsche, who recognizes that there is a kind of nobility to the human soul, gets to something. But all of these detach pieces of the wholeness of the classical tradition. And it seems to me in that detachment, we're on a kind of glide path to a post-liberal future. My preference then would be, and my recommendation would be, a post-liberalism that appeals to and draws and reinvents a kind of pre-liberal tradition for our post-liberal age, and rejects these various pathologies that I think are inherent in the modern form, the extremes of both individualism and collectivism that we see, the first two waves of modernity, or the alternative of being beyond good and evil in the third wave of modernity. Rather, a tradition that reintegrates the idea of liberty and authority, of virtue and the law, of politics as ennobling as well as restraining, of education undertaken in the pursuit and understanding both of wisdom and of virtue, of tradition, but tradition moderated by progress, and progress moderated by tradition. In other words, all these features I regard as something in my last book that I call a mixed constitution, integrating that which it seems to be modernity in many ways has split apart in its various waves. So rather than tell you all about that, let me stop there and see if you have any queries. Thanks very much. Okay. Ed, do we have time? Okay. Yes, sir.
Hello, sir. I'm midshipman fourth class Lee. So I have a question mainly in regard to how you can actually enforce, as you said, the repressive tolerance and ensuring that we don't see the counterculture two waves that you were talking about. My question is, how can like a government or just a society crack down on these, I guess, post-liberalisms while also not falling to the trap of revolution or counter-revolution, sir?
Yeah, it's a big question. Well, I would actually say that we've already undergone a revolution. I mean, it's not a revolution, maybe with the level of violence of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. I don't know how many of you saw the Wall Street Journal poll that appeared just about a year ago that tracks values of Americans, and in particular 5 values. The 5 values were patriotism, might be something you guys know about, you all know about here, family, having children, community, God, and money. And 25 years ago, this was the order. All above 50%, like 80% of Americans said that they valued patriotism. A small number below that valued family and religion and community. And then below 50%, like 37% said they valued money. Now maybe they were lying, but they lived in a society in which at least you thought it was sort of reputable that you lied about that. Right? But we can also say that in a society that cares a lot about country, God, family, and community, money is a lot less important. It's not unimportant, but it may not be the priority of your values. 25 years later, the same poll was taken last year, and it was completely reversed. All 4 of those that used to be above 50% were now below 50%. The losses of roughly 30 to 40% per question, depending on the question. And the only one that I think came close to 50% was money, which was highest. That's a revolution. That's a revolution in worldview that took place over 25 years. Now, it was a slow-moving revolution, a profound revolution, and it tracks some of the things that Dr. Levin was talking about in the last panel. So I think it's not a matter of how do we avoid a revolution. Frankly, I'm in favor of a counter-revolution. And maybe where I would differ in emphases with some of the previous panelists, is I don't think it's going to happen if we just lift government off of our backs. I think here there's a bit of a debate within the conservative world in which I take one side and my friends take another side, which is that a lot of the destruction that we're seeing has come about because of an imposition of government, and good things will happen from the bottom up. I think these are so, as Dr. Levin was talking about, these are so deeply emptied that in many ways I think we really need to think about those who care about the first 4 of those values and want to demote money as the central value of our society, need to think about how we use the power of law and the power of institutions, including government, local, state, national, to begin to push back and to recreate and to strengthen these forms of life that are central for human flourishing. And we're seeing some of that. That's what we're seeing among some universities, which are being instituted through laws, through state laws, right? Attempting not just to have a conservative professor, but create schools in which you ensure that Western civilization will be taught to the next generation. I think those who care about these commitments and see this as central to a flourishing society, not just for the elite, but for everyone, again, as was discussed in the last panel, really need to think about how we don't just rely on laissez-faire mechanisms, but a kind of counter-revolution has to take place through the use of actual political effort and law. So, short of, I'm not commending, and my book didn't commend violence, even though it is a call for a kind of regime change. In fact, I think if we want to avoid violence, this might be the best path. But we shall see. Thank you for your good question.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you for being here, Dr. Deneen. My name's Michael, and I'm with the Navy Reserve. It kind of seems like when we're discussing post-liberalism or liberal democracy, that liberal can mean a lot of things. It can mean the economic system, it can mean the current political left. And it seems like it's possible to move past those political and economic circumstances. But I guess my question is, when you look back to some of the foundational Enlightenment thinkers that see, human autonomy, agency, natural rights existing before any political or economic context, how can we move past that kind of fundamental perspective on human nature, regardless of what the economic or political circumstances are?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. So first, I think, as anyone who works in these areas, any ism that we're probably discussing is unwieldy, and everyone probably has a bit of their own definition. But one way that I do think about it is that, and it kind of tracks the first two waves of modernity that Strauss talks about, is that the first two waves of modernity in particular was a way of sort of dividing up Christianity, if I could put it that way. So in one guise or one understanding of Christianity, Christianity in many ways is about the sort of the inherent dignity of every human being, and that we are not merely herd creatures. We are not merely, sort of parts of not even parts, but to be absorbed into a collective. And of course, this is at the heart of Christianity. In many ways, you could say this is one of the revolutions. Speaking of revolutions, one of the revolutions in the world history is Christianity's kind of transformative way in which it brought people to understand that every human being has inherent dignity. And if you want to read about this revolution, I can recommend no better book on this than the book by Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, but the co-host of the great podcast, The Rest is History, who writes primarily about Roman history. But in writing about Roman history, he just got curious, what happened in the world that we went from a civilization that regarded human life like we would regard, a stink bug or something. Maybe we regard stink bugs better than human life was regarded then. What happened? And this is someone who was not Christian. And he simply followed the evidence. He said, guess what happened? It was Christianity. Christianity introduced this worldview. So this is something true that is included in classical liberalism, right? It's not all false. It's true that we are human beings that are and should be regarded as having a kind of inherent dignity. And the theory of rights was one way to articulate this. But the reaction against that, the second wave, which was a reaction, was a kind of correction and a kind of excessive correction, which is to say, no, we're not just individuals. We actually should understand ourselves as part of the whole, as indeed aspiring to become the whole, to be members of something larger than ourselves, not to be fundamentally individuals, but as parts of a collective, parts of a whole. And of course, this is Rousseau, this is Hegel, and of course, this is Karl Marx, who really wants us ultimately no longer to have individual egos, really. That the aspiration is that at his end of history, we will, in a sense, create heaven on earth and have ceased to be thinking as individuals. We won't want property, we won't want our own families, we won't have nations, right? So it's John Lennon's Imagine. That's the dream, as it were. So it's not just a matter of overturning a false view of human nature. I think, in a sense, all of the modern waves all have a false view of human nature that contains a partial truth. And so my call to sort of think anew about the tradition that the modern waves were overthrowing is, in a sense, to say, let's put all these pieces back together again, in a way in which they are sort of sufficiently cognizant of their own self-limitation. We're not all just individuals, and we're not just all species beings, but we are social and political animals who do have inherent dignity and need to be accorded that inherent dignity. And the politics of our day between the sort of neo-Marxist left, liberals, progressives, and the neo-Lockean right or the neo-Nietzschean right is all premised on a false understanding of human nature. And I subscribe to none of the above. And I invite you to join me in that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you for your response.
Good morning, Dr. Deneen.
Morning.
Thank you so much for your address. My name is Colby Gilly, and I'm a graduate student across the street at St. John's College.
I can tell from the bow tie.
I hope that's a good thing. If this question is better addressed by your book and you'd prefer to refer me there, please feel free to do so. But my question is, the post-liberalism that you've commended us to draws on a Western pre-liberalism. It also seems possible that perhaps by a certain Hegelian logic, Western pre-liberalism perhaps contained the seed that becomes liberalism. Is it possible to ascertain or understand how or whether the post-liberalism that you're commending, that draws on that, may have already within itself a seed that leads on to a new kind of liberalism?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I spend half of my waking days thinking about this, so I don't have any brief answer to it. But I will say the following, that your suggestion, and I'm not sure if you're implicitly or explicitly appealing this is a suggestion at the end of Strauss's essay. At the end of Strauss's essay, he says if I can jump back there, the tradition, the first of these traditions, is the closest to the classical tradition. And therefore, he says, had elements of classical antiquity within it. And therefore, in his view, is probably the most defensible. And of course, this is a man who fled Nazi Germany and wasn't particularly fond of communism, who sees, initially he flees to Britain and then to the United States and sees a more civilized and humane society. And that's simply undeniable. Right? But that suggestion at the end of the book, it's a very, like much of Strauss's writing, it's very ambiguous. Is he saying that historically it was close? So that when the American founding happens, it's also a very Christian society. It's a society that, as the bishops in the United States argued, who were arguing against Rome, which was condemning liberalism in America, they said, well, no, this Constitution was built better than the founders knew. It actually had elements of the classical and even natural law tradition within it, so we can't condemn it to court. And was that presence that also Tocqueville recognizes, the inheritance that the Americans have, and that you see on colleges like St. John's, the kind of classical architecture that was to symbolize. These are kind of institutions that are meant to appeal back to a pre-liberal age and as conduits of that tradition. Is that accidental or is it inherent? And I think there's, this is one of the bases on which, again, my friends, Professor Levin and Dr. Levin and Dr. Berkowitz, we argue about to some extent. Because I tend to the view that they were in many ways wonderful inheritances that were dispersed by the logic of liberalism itself and can't be easily remade or recreated from within the horizon of liberalism. At any rate, but it's such a good question because, of course, how you answer that question will also then, in a sense, open up how you will think we can act in the world. So, thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for
Okay, I'm sorry.
the talk.
Apparently, we can do one more. Or what's that? One more. One more. Okay, sorry. We'll chat. Yeah.
So I'd like to push you a bit on the interpretation of Mill you've brought to the table. I haven't read the Strauss and Marcuse pieces that you have referenced. If you're right about the Strauss and Marcuse pieces, I think they're strawmanning Mill to a great extent, and I think I wonder about some of the parts you haven't spoken about on Mill that have really convinced me to be a liberal. And some of those parts are like we've kind of talked about so far in this conference of Mill does talk a lot about virtues being practiced in liberalism because you have to be actively engaged inside of your own mind. In considerations on representative government, which you talked about, he says, well,
Marcuse talked about, but yeah.
well, yeah,
I
well,
mentioned
you
it because of
referenced
Marcuse.
from Marcuse. Thank you.
Yeah.
Why do we not want a government by a benevolent dictator? Not merely because we would get what we want or not what we want, but because then citizens wouldn't be able to practice their own freedom and become free people themselves. And also, I think he's wrong on the, wanting a plurality of votes for the more educated, but in a way, I think it follows from how he was a great defender of the push for more egalitarian public education in England at the time, right? It wasn't that, we'll just pull from the people who are already at Oxford and Cambridge now, but when we have the lower classes educated, then they will get an equal share of the vote. So I was just maybe wanting to hear about why those kinds of things were left out.
I'll just very briefly, because I know we're up against the hour. I hope I don't, and this is just for the purposes of this talk, and in the class I'm teaching, I really do try to give the full picture of Mill,
Sure.
which is, everything that you said is there. And what my comments were really meant to underscore is a kind of, deep paradox within Mill's own argument. And it's a paradox that's played out on every college campus today, which is freedom sort of for the sake of, everyone here will ask, why do we have academic freedom? We have academic freedom because that's how we will arrive at the truth. Well, when you arrive at the truth, what happens? Okay, we have arrived at the truth that human beings shouldn't enslave other human beings. Do we need to hire faculty who will be making arguments that, nope, we have the Department of Slavery Studies, and the Department of, like the Department of Women's Studies isn't against women, the Department of Slavery Studies isn't against slavery. Are we called to do that, to make sure that we're having this internal? In other words, Mill himself suggests that part of this, that the purpose of freedom is to arrive at conclusions. And when somebody says the science is settled, that's what they're appealing to. Right? They're appealing to that, we have an answer to this question. Now, when you achieve the answer to the question, there are going to be a lot of people out there who haven't gotten to that point yet, who haven't reached that new, better answer. They're still in the despotism of custom. And okay, England was a relatively more progressive society, so we thought, maybe we need to have plural voting because we don't want the backward masses to kind of derail progress. But when it came to non-progress society, he was quite clear that on page 1 of a book called On Liberty, he says, well, when dealing with savages and barbarians, despotism is required and personal slavery may be needed for a period of time in order to get them to be industrious and to work. Is that a part of Mill you agree with? I suspect not, and I don't mean that. But it's amazing how many people's eyes just gloss over that passage, not noticing it in this book called On Liberty. And again, I don't mean to say that this is the sum and total of what Mill argues, but it points to the instability. And that's really what I'm pointing to, is that the instability in Mill we ought not to be surprised that out of a Millian regime, we get a kind of oppressive, progressive regime. And the irony today is that it's the conservatives who are most appealing to John Stuart Mill. Again, I'm naming names, Robbie George, my friend, former colleague at Princeton University. His hero today, in terms of the oppression of conservative voices on college campuses, is John Stuart Mill. Well, the irony of appealing to John Stuart Mill, it's just too rich to comment on, because it's in many ways because of this logic in Mill that people like Professor George are such minorities on their campuses now. He represents the old orthodoxy, and now we have the new orthodoxy. So I really highlight this just to point out that within the logic of Mill's argument, it's not unthinkable and even potentially predictable to see the outcome that we've seen today.
Thank you for bringing this to bear on the liberal marketplace of ideas.
All right. Well, Patrick, thank you for that. I think you've convinced many of us that things could be better in liberal societies. But I want you to take comfort on one thing. The Naval Academy is not a modern university. Or West Point, for that matter, or the Air Force Academy, or St. John's. We encourage debate, and because of that, invite you back anytime you want to come in and speak again. Thank you. Next week, all right. So, I'm sure you're hungry. All midshipmen here are welcome to eat upstairs, and we will start again at 45 with Dr. Fukuyama.